was that at the center of human experience is speech and language. And the way we speak and the way we speak and the way we make use of language can tell us a lot about also how we relate to one another.
So welcome everyone again in Politically with Basu. Today we have a very special guest with us. He's a practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst, a sociological theorist. He's currently working as an assistant professor at the infamous Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. He's also a visiting associate professor at other universities like the University College of Dublin, University College of Cork, etc. He works in several academic fields, including social movement studies, Lacanian psychoanalysis, cultural sociology, gender and sexuality studies, anarchist studies, and aesthetics. He helped contribute to the emergence of a very new field of scholarly investigation known as the post-anarchism. So I really welcome Professor Rouselle here for taking out his very precious time. So thank you so much, sir, for accepting the invitation.
Thank you so much for extending the invitation. I was telling another professor here, one of two that I know, that it felt like quite the honor, in fact, because I do a lot of podcasts, in the United States and in London and even a few in Russia. But I've given lectures in India, but I haven't done a podcast. So it's mutual. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I was actually checking out a lot of your content in YouTube. I think you have your own YouTube channel as well. I was just going through it like a few weeks back. Then I thought that why not just contact you through Facebook, since we were I had added you as a friend quite some time ago. So my first question is something very banal, but it's what is exactly Freud's research about? If you can just simply say about, in very simple terms, for someone who is just starting out reading Freud.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. Because, on the one hand, it's easier to say maybe what Freud's work is not about, at least to begin with. So, we could say Freud is not a scholar in the traditional sense of the term. He wasn't a professor. He and most of his followers, including the one that I follow, Jacques Lacan, they had a certain discomfort with the professorial position, because to them, I think they believed that the professor tends to promote a certain, we can call it a discourse, like a certain knowledge, let's say, a certain position in relation to knowledge that Lacan called university discourse, which is systematic. So Freud would have said they promote a worldview. And a worldview for Freud is any, let's say, intellectual position which tries to answer every question in a systematic way, maybe in a sort of totalizing way. And Freud called those people systems builders. Like philosophers, he said they were intent on patching up holes in the universe. And psychoanalysis, on the other hand, is, I wouldn't say anti-systematic, but it's non-systematic. It begins with the human experience. And what Freud discovered, and it took Lacan to articulate it, was that at the center of human experience is speech and language. And the way we speak and the way we speak and the way we make use of language can tell us a lot about also how we relate to one another, and why and how we suffer.
Right. Why is Freud so famous in a sense? Like whenever I talk to people engaging with psychology as well as a discipline, the first thing that hits is, "Have you read Freud?" So why his work is so outreachable in a sense?
You know, it's interesting you say he's famous. I would say he's infamous, which is quite different from being famous because, you know, what there's well, there's a number of possible responses to your really fantastic question. Um, the first one is that he's infamous because everybody thinks they understand, they know Freud
Mm,
without necessarily having read very much of Freud, in fact.
right,
Everybody thinks, for example, it's quite popular to believe that Freud was phallocentric, that he believed that, I don't know, an umbrella equals a penis in the dream
right,
interpretation and
right,
these sort of
right, right, right.
things. And you can sort of reduce it all to that. So there's a certain reputation that we are supposed to be against Freud. And I would say
Mm,
this is almost universal, though it's not entirely universal. But you know, I wrote a book titled Jacques Lacan and American Sociology, and what I tried to do in that book was to trace America, the American scholarly reception of Freud, and why it was that they rejected Freud's most essential contributions, namely the unconscious, death drive, and so on. So in America, I would say, I mean, there's basically everybody's against Freud. It's more exceptional to be a close reader of Freud, and you'll find a few people here and there in New York City, and maybe
right,
in Canada, in Toronto, maybe in California. But it's much more exceptional to be Freudian or to be interested in the Freudian cause than it is to to believe that Freud has something to offer. A second part to the question is that Freud is infamous because so many of his ideas are infused in our everyday knowledge now that we take it for granted and we don't even know it was Freud who developed these ideas. For example, that when we make a slip, what Freud called a parapraxis, when we say something other than what we intended, it's revealing uh, an unconscious formation of one sort or another. Our dreams, maybe, as expressions of
right.
wish fulfillment. In Indian culture, this has been here
Yeah,
long before Freud, but nonetheless, these are ideas that we kind of take for granted, you know, and many others. So Freud was a pioneer, but it's a question of what he discovered, because ultimately what he discovered was how to listen for the discoveries of others. It was his patients that discovered things. You know, it was through his first patient, for example, the most popular one, where he discovered hysteria and he discovered what I think she called chimney sweeping, namely the technique of free association or speaking freely in order to uncover the latent determinations.
right.
It was his patients. He learned everything from his patients.
Right. Since we were talking about his patients, do you think that the kind of selection pool, like in like the logical positivist research, we often have this understanding that we have to justify what are our variables in a sense. So, with respect to most of the research that or the topics that Freud is, for example, the Oedipus complex, for example, the entire idea revolves around it. So, with respect to the patients, the selection of these patients, whether they were from the upper middle class or middle class, with respect to cultural diversity, is there any limitation to Freud in that sense?
There's many limitations to Freud. Um, I think Freud, it would be a fair critique to say that Freud aspired to see his Oedipus complex, which was a relatively late
Yeah,
articulation of Freud, to discover it everywhere to such an extent. And here I'm only discovering this first. There's people in India who already know this, who have known this for a long time, that it can't be so easily universalized, the Oedipus complex. From the very beginning here in India, you probably know there was Dr. Bose who had a correspondence with Freud, and he sought to demonstrate that there was something different going on that he was hearing from his patients here in India. And it couldn't be reduced to the Oedipus complex. He described Oedipus's mother and the limitations of castration, the castration complex, and what he thought was a pervasive wish to be feminine. It was here in India where it's quite dismissive, I would say, of Bose's ideas, which are now, well, I wouldn't call it return of the repressed, but I would say Bose's ideas are in line with much of the European contemporary psychoanalytic perspectives. So I do think that Freud sought to maybe generalize a bit too much his Oedipus complex, but at the same time, he did have a modest assessment of his own theories. And you can even see that in his correspondence with Bose, for example, where he never said he had the answer. You know, he was always open to hearing something that would change his point of view. In science, we call that falsification, I suppose.
Yeah. Actually, I was going through some of your previous podcasts, and I just stumbled upon something where you were talking. I think there is another book that you wrote where psychoanalysis and religion, you were trying to draw these parallels. So, what was Freud's opinion with respect to religion, morality, God? What is this connection with respect to Freud?
It's a very difficult topic. Some would say that for Freud's Jewish atheism, we might call it. And you know, I'm not really a scholar of Freud, to be honest with you. I'm more of a Lacanian, but so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I think that what you see in Freud's essay, The Future of an Illusion, and then as it developed into a better essay, Civilization and Its Discontents, and into his later Moses and Monotheism, Totem and Taboo, and so on, is he's struggling with some religious questions. For example, he opens up both The Future of an Illusion and Civilization and Its Discontents. I think quite quickly he discusses his friend, Roland, who was a mystic, who said, you cannot deny the religious experience. I'm going from memory. It's been years since I've actually read Civilization and Its Discontents, but he said, you can't deny the experience of people who encounter something of a religious feeling, which he referred to as an oceanic feeling. And Freud, I think, quite quickly reduces that to his Oedipus complex. To some extent, he says, well, what that oceanic feeling of oneness, oneness like a drop in the ocean, is a desire to return to the protection of a father or the connection with the mother or something like this. Very quickly he went there. And so he was led to a certain conclusion, I think, almost to equate religion with a type of neurosis that he would have called obsessional neurosis.
Right.
So it led Lacan in, I think, the middle part of his teaching to ask a very interesting question. You know what he asked? He was giving a seminar and he was speaking to his students, okay, Lacan, who called for a return to Freud. He thought himself quite the orthodox reader of Freud, Lacan. And he said, can we say, I'm paraphrasing, can we say that an analysis has been brought to its conclusion if at the end of an analysis, the patient, what we call the analyst, still retains his prior belief in God? In other words, there's a certain sense in which we're supposed to be an atheist at the end of analysis. Yeah. I'm not convinced of this so much. So it's it's a very complicated question, and the reason I wrote this book, the book on sort of religion, was really a book on love and religion, and let's say the different ways in which religious discourses articulate something in relation to the question of love. And I think that each of the religions sort of discreetly will answer the question of love in a different way. It was because I had a feeling that there is something more still to be said about the question of religion. Why is it, for example, that so many Christians are drawn to Lacanian psychoanalysis? And you can see groups of Jesuits in Ireland, for example. We know about Lacan's relationship to Christianity. He called Roman Catholicism the only true religion. Why? And we can see how there was something of a religious impulse that led Bose and his followers and those who are still, let's say, involved in the Indian psychoanalytic societies and so on, to think psychoanalysis in relationship to Hindu, I don't know what to call them, archetypes, myths, or whatever. So, of course, wrote a whole book on Hinduism, and Freud is mentioned throughout it, but the book is on Hinduism. As far as I know, I'm just encountering this for the first time myself in the last few days, if I'm being honest with you. So there's something more to be said. I don't trust personally the atheist position. There's an early, a young Hegelian by the name of Max Stirner, Johann Sebastian Schmidt was his real name, and he said, our atheists are the most pious people. Our atheists are the most pious people. Because if the unconscious means anything at all, it means that even when we consciously say we don't believe, there is an agency inside of us that believes for us anyway.
Yeah.
So you can say, for example, and then I'll shut up. You can say, for example, oh, I'm not a Christian, but why is it that when you get into a fight with your partner as an atheist, who was raised a Christian, but now an atheist, an avowed atheist, why is it that when you fight, the way that you overcome your arguments is in a very Christian ethical way? Let's agree to disagree, love thy neighbor. But when I hear, for example, those who have been raised in Muslim cultures, when they get into arguments with one another in their romantic lives, often, though not always, they won't say, let's agree to disagree. They'll say, let's find a minimal point of agreement. Like, hey, we both agree with this. We're both Muslim. Let's start there, and we can repair our social bond. Why? It's because in Islam, there's no ethical injunction to love thy neighbor as thyself in the Quran, maybe in a hadith, but not in the Quran. Instead, the ethical maxim is, oh, people of the book, we must come to common terms.
Nice.
So we could ask, what's the Hindu way? Let's say you're an atheist, but you were raised maybe Hindu or a Buddhist way and so on. And I think that there's something to it. I'm simplifying to the extreme, and I would problematize my own theory that I'm giving you right now, but I think it does convey something important about the way in which we can't so quickly, like the struggle is not to believe, as people often think. People often think, make me believe in your religion. The struggle is to actually become an atheist. It's really hard. I think it's a very difficult thing. That's all I'll say.
So, usually in the Hindu traditions, like we have read Amartya Sen's book as well, The Argumentative Indian, where it was trying to hint about the Charvaka traditions within the Hindu sect, where it was kind of a parallel between atheism and Charvaka traditions, where it was more about seeking like we use these words very lightly in our generation, at least, agnostics or atheism. So with respect to agnosticism also, like how do you bring this school of thought within this discussion? Agnosticism.
Agnosticism.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. I don't know. I don't know. I think the agnostics and the atheists, I would say, are, at least in the Western world, I think they're very close to one another.
Yeah.
I wonder the extent, I can't say for sure, but I wonder the extent to which the agnostic is simply an agreeable person, to the extent that they will disavow their belief. They'll say, well, I can't know for sure, but I also
Yeah.
can't say I don't believe. And so what you get is a certain logic of disavowal. The structure of disavowal, the logical syntax is, I know very well, but, and so you sort of affirm while deny at the same time.
Right, right.
So the atheist, by contrast, tries to adopt a similar perspective, but the atheist oftentimes, at least in the contemporary Western world, I wouldn't say it would be true so much in South Asia, but the atheist is often close to the scientific position in the West, though not exclusively, and they tend not to disavow or doubt so much as I think they tend to promote a certain level of certainty. And that's what scares me, because a discourse of certainty is whether it's a fanatical discourse of belief or a fanatical discourse that promotes non-belief. It's the position of being certain about something that I think is a very dangerous.
Becomes problematic in a sense. Yeah. Now, I was while we were discussing this, I was interested in how, like, right now, the field of psychoanalysis per se has evolved after Freud.
Yeah, it's evolved in a lot of different ways. I'm a bit of a dogmatist in this sense, because I'm interested in one very narrow part of the Freudian orientation, which is the contemporary Lacanian orientation.
Yeah,
And then even within the Lacanian orientation, I'm in a very small sort of area. But it's gone in all kinds of different directions. There are, of course, those who probably in the West, the most popular are the object relations psychoanalysts, and those who emphasize the maternal position. There's the Jungians, who have become quite popular in recent years again, mostly because of something happened there when I think Jordan Peterson became a bit more famous. Suddenly people started returning to Jung, and I even had students bringing me Jung's books and trying to get me to read them, So yeah, I mean, but the problem of trying to produce a sort of typography of let's say the evolution of Freud, it would presume that there was something deficient in Freud, and we've grown, but it's kind of weird. It's like all roads seem to bring us back to Freud. In a weird way, like we can critique this and that, but then, as soon as I say that Freud tried too hard to generalize his Oedipus complex, for example, I can go back to some of his essays and I can show you that he didn't. And so I always, I can't get beyond Freud, if I'm being quite honest. So I think Lacan was right, especially in his early teaching, to call for a return to Freud. Every time I think I understand Freud, I go back and I read and I realize he's way ahead of, not just me, he's way ahead of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is fashionable. He's ahead of mindfulness approaches. His work is really, we are struggling to catch up to it, I think, is the real way to think about the evolution of Freud. It's us who have to evolve as readers of Freud. We need to evolve into being attentive to, at the risk of deifying Freud, but we have to recognize Freud's genius, no matter how unfashionable it is to do so. I mean, I've been returning to Freud recently because For the new Lacanian school, which is an orientation that I follow, there was an argument put forward in advance of an upcoming Congress. And some of the arguments, these are contemporary arguments that have to do with the contemporary discontents of civilization. They've led us, me and others that are doing research with me, back to some of Freud's texts. And I'm discovering things I had no idea. It's already there. This idea of our I don't know what to call it except for a certain type of agoraphobia that we all seem to have now because we're sort of tethered to our gadgets, to our phones. Freud already foresaw this. He foresaw it in a number of places. For example, I'm just rereading an essay of his titled Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety. He foresaw it there. He foresaw the civilization and its discontents when he said, man, I'm paraphrasing, man is content to form himself into a prosthetic god, which is this idea of like,
Prosthetic god as in?
a prosthetic god. Well, what does it mean? If you'll allow me just a moment, because it's quite clever. The way I read it is the way that Marshall McLuhan, Canadian media theorist who inaugurated a new field known as media ecology. He's one of our big thinkers in Canada. He's dead now. He did. Marshall McLuhan, he wrote this essay titled The Extensions of Man. And this is really a development of Freud's idea of man becoming a prosthetic god. What does it mean? Well, you're wearing glasses. Yeah. And your glasses are, well, they're not a gadget, but they're an extension of something innate, your vision. With your glasses, you can see further than you can and with more focus than you can. The telescope can extend our vision further and with more focus. The car can extend our feet by allowing us to run faster without getting tired and over longer distance. The airplane allows us to jump over oceans, so it extends our feet. The water bottle is an extension of our hands, we can cup water without it leaking. And so this idea of extending, it was Freud's idea. A lot of our inventions are meant to extend our innate human
possibility,
but not to separate from ourselves in so doing. And that's the dangerous part, because we're tethered to our extensions in some agoraphobic sense, is how I would put it. Like, in an essay I wrote 2 weeks ago for Sublation magazine, I came up with this ridiculous idea that the phone is really a mobile bedroom. Because, like, in a sense, it allows us to always be in our bedroom, and so a lot of philosophers today are writing, their philosophy texts from their phones. Like, it's like you're doing philosophy in the bedroom, and you never have to go out and actually encounter the world, the world that would interrupt your narcissism in a sense, and force you to hear what other people are saying instead of just falling into the echo chamber of social media. So, well, Freud was already way ahead of us, and so for me, I'm just struggling to catch up to Freud, and I'm not sure I will in my lifetime, to be honest. But I'm really trying. I find it easier to catch up to Lacan than Freud.
No, this actually got me, because I was also thinking about this social media trap in a sense. Anyways, I was just the last question, and we can just wrap it up in a way. What is the relevance of Freud and psychoanalysis in the 21st century? The relevance of Freudian thought, because you saying that you have to keep going back to it, because it's like the primary literature of sorts. But if society itself has, because social media, for example, it's not going anywhere. So the studies like this, what is the relevance of it in the next coming 5, 10 years, 20 years?
It's a really good question. I'm split because on the one hand, I wonder if it's relevant to anyone. I believe it's relevant, but it's a question of whether others do, because Freudian psychoanalysis, I see the time, remaining time here on the top, so I'll be mindful of it. Psychoanalysis is sort of almost caught between the temptation to be a science, on the one hand, which it refuses, but it does nonetheless try and think of itself in certain scientific ways. We have formulas and schemas and so on. And the other temptation, which is the religious temptation, which is a temptation to form maybe tribal groups and these sorts of things. And both of those temptations are very dangerous because science, what Lacan discovered, can become a little soulless. You can lose your what is your relationship to what you're studying? What is the human condition when we're talking about science? This is an important question. And on the other hand, religion can be, I mean, the way people circumambulate temples and so on. It can be a source of obsessional suffering as well. And so psychoanalysis, if it's going to be relevant, I think needs to maintain its ground against both science and religion, while nonetheless finding what is most essential about science and religion for its own purposes. Psychoanalysis is one of the very few spaces of refuge we have today, for example, where we can still talk about our suffering in ways where people are not using their words for us, where we can invent unique ways out of our own suffering through talking. Not through some scientists saying we've done all these studies and we have a particular p-value and we can if you do this particular test or activity, we can ascertain within a certain probability that you will feel whatever. Psychoanalysis, at least for me, it was a refuge in a time of war. And it was a place where I could speak and take a breath, and so
the humanist angle in a way. The humanist angle in a way. The humanist angle in a way.
It's humanist, but it doesn't lack its scientific ways.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the work of Freud and Lacan more than Freud, it was very clear that they were extracting bits and pieces from all of the various sciences and disciplines around them, from set theory, from philosophy, from religion. They were taking what they could from all around them. And if you look at Freud's two topographies, they're quasi-scientific in terms of their articulation, almost formulaic. If you look at Freud's what he called math themes, which looks like algebra, you notice very quickly that the Lacanians are using a lot of mathematics, topology, and so they're not opposed to these things. They just do it in a way where I think we can still feel some connection to ourselves. I mean, a fashionable word is there's still a place for subjectivity. That's the fashionable word. The subject can have a space to exist. Lacan's concern with science was that the subject can cease to exist in science. That's maybe a discussion for another time.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Rouselle, for this time.
Thank you very much.
And due to limitation of Zoom, I think we'll have to wrap it up. But thank you so much for giving us this precious time.